science, we have an account of how we came to be primates who have morally salient emotions like disgust, say. And that's a story for evolutionary biology and psychology. But there's another project, which is we can figure out how we can experience the greatest well-being based on how conscious states arise in the brain and how they're impacted by the world. And that's a very different project. That flies free of the perch that has been built for us by evolution. I mean, that's where we can talk about how to raise compassionate children, despite the fact that and how we could change the genome to be more compassionate, if such a thing is possible. The question of whether all of that is possible is very different from the question of how we got here. And the third project is just to convince people to drop all of the moral commitments that lead to unnecessary human misery, and that's a political and it's a project of persuasion, and that is also distinct, and they often get conflated.
I think we should open it up for questions. That there are 2 microphones, I believe, and please wait for the microphone before asking the question. I think Stephen will moderate.
Working? Testing? If you need to hold the microphone like this so that it points towards your mouth or no one will hear you, okay? Who would like to ask a question?
Hi, thank you both for an interesting discussion and your talk. I agree that science is not a value-free enterprise and that there are many oughts that factor into what questions get asked and what research priorities we have. I was curious as to how the moral landscape feeds back on science, because as science is progressing, especially now versus, say, 50 years ago, we're running up against these questions which previously we just took for granted. Is death an unquestionable evil? Is pain an unquestionable evil? Is aging an unquestionable evil? And the answers to these questions and the people in charge of these, the scientists who are in charge and the people who are funding these scientists, it's an important question to ask. And it will greatly affect the outcomes and what we actually can know about these sort of things. So I was wondering how the moral landscape feeds back on science.
Well, one way, if I understand the thrust of your question, one way it feeds back on science is it makes intelligible the claim that certain truths about the universe may be best left unknown. I mean, it's quite possible that there is intrinsically damaging knowledge given what we are. Say, I mean, it's a certain knowledge that human beings, it would be rational not to have this knowledge if we could foresee the consequences of having it. And I think we all understand this and agree to it intuitively. I mean, we're not committed to just the maximum dissemination of information, and we're not busily teaching everyone how to synthesize smallpox. You know, it's not. We don't want to make sure everyone has these facts in hand, and it's rational not to want to spread that around. And I think we could find ourselves in an area of science where the downside of knowing certain facts, or certainly knowing how to act on certain facts, technologically speaking, if foreseeable. These things are almost never foreseeable, but if foreseeable, or in hindsight, we would say it would be better if we didn't pursue that. This is something that Dan Dennett has spoken about a little bit. That's intelligible to me. Now you're going to get the people who say, no, I just want to know everything, and my well-being is predicated on knowing everything, and I'm just not going to be happy if we don't know everything. That, I think, is very likely not an honest claim. And if you start looking at, you just have to keep raising the stakes of the downside for that person to back off that claim, I think. You don't want to know everything if it's going to mean the world is going to be plunged into internecine horror for a century. So I hope that dealt with the spirit of your question.
Could science ever prove that a healthy brain is a moral brain? And, for example, a psychopath who likes killing is born with an unhealthy brain, or even that religion or culture can basically create brain damage?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm looking around quite bewildered. I just can't see where the question came from. But, there you go. Very good question. I think, if you buy my argument, this is the crux of my argument. The argument is that if you're someone who thinks you prefer to be neurotic and unhappy and incapable of creative work and cut off from the rest of humanity, if you think you'd rather live in a society where millions of people suffer unendurable misery, there is something wrong with you. Okay. Objectively wrong with you? Yes. Okay. In the sense that your brain is preventing you, the state of your brain is preventing you from wanting or even conceiving of other states of higher states of consciousness. Now, higher with respect to what? Higher as in further from the lowest possible state of consciousness, the worst possible misery for everyone. Is the worst possible misery for everyone really bad? Well, here I would say we have hit philosophical bedrock with the shovel of a stupid question. This is, if you're not going to admit that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, then I don't see how to budge you from there, but I don't think it's an honest declaration.
First of all, I agree with your framework, and I admire the way that you've attempted to build it up. However, I think in order to move forward, in order to make it practical, you need to overcome the classical problem of subjectivity, which is that, one person's experience is their experience, and how do you then make judgments about that in relation to other people? And I was wondering what your opinion was on what science can say about that, with things like functional MRIs revealing more about ourselves. Do you think that holds an area for progress in being able to make a framework like the one you've outlined practical for moral judgments in the real world?
Yeah, well, this concern really visits us everywhere in the sciences of mind. How is it that you can study human subjectivity and make objective claims about first-person facts? There's a lot of confusion around this issue of subjectivity versus objectivity, and because we use these words in two distinct ways. In an epistemological way, which describes how we think of reason about the world, and in an ontological way, in terms of what there just is to be reasoned about. And clearly we can reason and speak and think objectively about subjective facts. And we do this all the time in psychology and neuroscience. We can talk about depression. We can talk about what it's like to be you. We can talk about whether you feel the pain in your right knee or your left knee. These are subjective facts. These are first-person facts. And yet you don't have to be self-deceived or illogical or merely led by wishful thinking to talk. I mean, these are not merely these are in the purview of science. Now, it's always a tricky experimental question just how much you can take somebody's word for their experience. I mean, we're not incorrigible judges of our experience. We can be wrong. We can be self-deceived. You can put me in an experiment where I think I'm choosing something based on my previous history of liking red versus blue, say, but I have been primed unconsciously by the experimenters to choose what I chose, and I have absolutely no subjective insight into it, and yet it is actually, we can prove, the cause of my behavior. So people can be wrong about their subjectivity, and I think we can be wrong about just not just the unconscious sources of it, but we can actually be wrong about its character. We can just be bad witnesses to what it's like to be us in the context of consciousness, and consciousness therefore is trainable. We can learn to make discriminations that are more refined. But so it's a gem, but if it's a problem for morality, it is a problem for every scientific study of every state of consciousness, psychology and cognitive neuroscience.
You mentioned consequentialism. Do you think that's a sufficient basis for morality?
I do if you revise it the way I have attempted to. I think consequences are what matter. So when you bring forward a traditional retort to consequentialism like deontology or like Kant's categorical imperative, that only makes sense as a moral framework if, in fact, its consequences are good. If you have consequences that are obviously horrible, it would no longer count as a rule for morality. And so too with a Rawlsian analysis of justice, say. Now, if you're going to go with Rawls and say that justice, it's not well-being that we care about, it's justice or fairness, say. Well, give me a world that maximizes justice, but which leads to the needless misery of millions. I mean, if the perfectly just world, the perfectly fair world, immiserates millions who, if you turn the dial of fairness just a little bit, wouldn't suffer in that way, well, then you want to turn that dial. It only counts as a moral precept because we recognize, I think rightly, that fairness and justice are hugely beneficial to us, and we all tend to profit from a system in which fairness and justice rank very high on our list of moral concerns. But I think the cash value is always the consequences in terms of what I'm calling well-being. And again, well-being is like health. It can keep absorbing the next thing we care about. If you come forward and say, no, you don't understand, there's this other thing that's so important that you're neglecting to consider, its importance is always going to show up in terms of positive changes in the conscious states of any conscious creature that could experience that thing. Yeah.
This last hour has been a lot of fun to listen to because we've been engaging in what seems like a very thoughtful, fruitful, intelligent exercise in secular moral reasoning, which is an important thing to do. But I think why we all came here is because you seem to be claiming to do something much, much more interesting than that. Namely, that you could appeal to science to say something that's objectively true about morality, rather than simply use science as a way to feed us facts into the normal secular moral reasoning that we'd all like to think we could engage in. Yet when you put down the philosophical cornerstone of your case, you seem to appeal to common sense, sort of low-hanging fruit. Wouldn't everybody say it's objectively wrong or it's really bad, as you put it, when you sort of qualify your statement? Wouldn't you say it's bad to throw acid on someone's face? We'd all say it's bad, but that's not the philosophically interesting case that you were proposing to make. So it seems like you may be caught between either making a common sense argument on the one hand or an inability to define your position in a strong sense on the other hand. How are you making that really interesting claim that we can turn to science to tell us what's objectively morally true without simply referring to the low-hanging fruit of throwing acid on people's faces and so on?
Yeah, good question. Well, the moment you grant that we're talking about well-being, that we're right to talk about well-being, we can't conceive of something else to talk about in this space, then all of the facts that determine well-being become the facts of science, because well-being is emerging out of the laws of nature in some way. Our conscious states are constrained quite clearly by the laws of nature, whatever they turn out to be. If they entail ectoplasm rising off the brain at death and going to the Christian hell, we're still talking about the way the universe is, and that would have to fall into the purview of some completed science. Now, obviously, there's no reason to believe in any of that, but so you could ask a question like, just how important is compassion? Say, I mean, what is compassion? What is the genetic basis for compassion? Is there what are the practices and uses of attention and institutions that allow compassion to thrive or diminish it? And if there's a trade-off, I mean, just how important is compassion, and if we have a tension between compassion and bureaucratic efficiency, say, what is the right balance there. Now, again, these are all the details, the level of brains and the level of lived experience are incredibly complicated.